I am Nicholas Morin, also known as the Chieftain, and you are here to hear about the Barnes two-man heavy tank of the United States. Then Lieutenant Colonel Gladeon M. Barnes from the U.S. Army's Ordnance Department casts a long shadow over tank development in the USA in the period around the start of World War II. Barnes was an interesting man, but some of his ideas and designs were demonstrative, perhaps, of a disconnect between his thinking and military reality. One such example came in 1938 with the idea for a small heavy tank armed with a single machine gun. Quite what role such a vehicle was meant to fulfill is hard to imagine years after other users of such vehicles had already accepted the serious inherent limitations of such a design. Somewhat oddly, the inspiration for this idea appears to have come from the Spanish Civil War. Section G2, i.e. the department responsible for intelligence in the U.S. Army, examined that conflict for lessons in a report titled Tank Lessons from the Spanish Civil War. They concluded that tanks were too poorly armored, used in too few numbers, and that they were not maneuverable enough. In that war, the primary tanks being used were the German-supplied Panzer I, the Italian CV-3 series light tank, and the Soviet-supplied T-26 light tank. During that war, as G2 correctly pointed out, tanks tended to be used in small numbers or alone, and both the CV-3 series and the T-26 had thin armor, about 14 or 15 millimeters maximum, meaning that both were just barely bulletproof. The T-26 had an advantage over the CV-3 in the addition of a turret-mounted weapon, while CV-3 was stuck with only its armament being a single mounting on the front left of the hull facing forwards. Neither tank was able to demonstrate much speed, although the CV-3 was a bit faster, just under 30 miles an hour, 48 kilometers an hour, compared to just under 20 miles an hour, 32 kmh, for the T-26, although the overall difference in practical effect was slight. Both tanks were too slow, both suffered from narrow tracks and a relatively underpowered engine. Any reasonable and objective assessment of the use of tanks in the Spanish Civil War would reflect this. The Italians, for example, understood from the conflict the severe limitations of the CV-3 for tank versus tank combat and undertook work on turreted light tanks for submergency. The Germans and the Soviets likewise looked and learned. Why then the US saw a possible solution lying in a vehicle with the same sort of layout as the CV-3 but with even less armament is difficult to comprehend. Barnes's concept was for a small, light tank, just 7 US tons, or 6.35 metric tons, and just 11 feet, or 3.35 meters long. For comparison, the Italian CV-3 was less than half the weight, shorter, narrower, and lower, and the Soviet T-26 was heavier, slightly longer, wider, and taller. With a crew of just 2, both men would have their work cut out for them. One man had to drive the tank and operate its radio, almost certainly sat on the left, just like on the light tank T-3. The other crew member would have to both command the tank and operate the armament, would sit on the right alongside the other man. This is a very similar arrangement to the Italian CV-3, except the crew position/roles were reversed. It could be considered that these possible reductions in size and capability were, in fact, simply the means to get the most tank possible for the least money. However, here Barnes trips up a bit. He provided a cost estimate of $20,000 US. In 1938, $20,000 was a huge sum of money, equivalent to over $350,000 in 2020 values. The drawing of Barnes's vehicle shows a single machine gun, and the annotation states this to be a single caliber 30, or about a 7.62mm, weapon with a 60-degree traverse range, presumably 30 degrees to each side. An alternative armament was also proposed, a 37mm gun. Once more, this was to be mounted in the front, seriously limiting its potential effectiveness. On top of this failing, operating a gun is a lot of work to load, aim, and fire, and perhaps because of this, Barnes did propose that it could be automatically fed. Thus, the commander would have to only command the tank, aim, and fire the gun. Even so, the tank, limited by the traverse of its gun, would still be inferior to the Soviet T-26. If the CV-3 and T-26 were unsuitable, with armor only 15mm at most, then the goal would be to have more, presumably to make the tank protected against automatic cannon fire such as the potent 20mm Breda cannon, which was a proven armor killer in Spain. It would also mean anti-tank rifles would be less useful against tanks, so more armor was not an unreasonable goal. Barnes wanted up to 1.5 inches, about 38mm, of armor on this small, heavy tank. For purposes of comparison, the Czech LT VZ-35, better known as the Panzer 35T in German service in World War II, a tank which is possibly the preeminent and most modern turreted tank of the era, had just 25mm across the whole front. What Barnes was indeed proposing was a tank the size of the diminutive American light tank T3, a little bit larger than the CV-3 light tank, but with armor heavier than most of the tanks then in European service. All that to carry just a single and rather limited machine gun, a task even the CV-3 did more effectively with two machine guns mounted together. The speed and agility of the vehicles in the Spanish Civil War were seen as a failure because of insufficiency. Therefore, Barnes should have been looking for a vehicle able to exceed the speed of CV-3. Instead, he managed to make a vehicle which, even under ideal circumstances, was larger, heavier, and slower. The power-to-weight ratio of this design was to be 20 to 25 horsepower per ton, and with an estimated 7-ton weight, that would mean an engine of 140 to 175 horsepower. Ideally, this would mean a top speed of 20 miles an hour, 32 kilometers an hour on a slight slope, and 35 miles an hour, 56 kilometers an hour, on a road. On paper, this all sounded good, but paper designs are kind of like that, and a magic engine can be produced from thin air with imaginary performance. When the design meets reality, things change, and this is exemplified by the light tank T3. Although Barnes did not specify which engine was going to be used, the light tank T3, produced 2 years earlier in 1936, gives a good idea of the problems. Both vehicles clearly used a pair of volute-sprung bogies, each with two wheels and a front-mounted drive sprocket, meaning the transmission was in the front. The light tank T3 is very similar in size, suspension and armament and appearance to Barnes's idea, and was fitted with a 221 cubic inch or 3.62-liter Ford V8 engine. Despite being slightly over 3.54 US tons, or 3.2 metric, this vehicle had half the armor Barnes was proposing, yet had the same top speed. The light tank T3 was the same size as Barnes's idea, with half the armor, half the weight, and yet the same desired performance, meaning that whatever Barnes was considering would have to be significantly more powerful and yet fit into the same space available in the T3. This was no small order, although Combat Car T5 of 1933 had managed to cram a 235 horsepower air-cooled Continental R670 radial petrol engine inside, all for 6.29 US tons. 5.71 metric, although armor was just about half an inch to 5/8 of an inch thick, i.e. 12.7 to 16 millimeters. The closest vehicle, perhaps, to Barnes's idea was not actually the light tank T3, but the light tank T6. Built in 1939, 1 year after Barnes's 1938 concept, the light tank T6 departed from the suspension of the light tank T3, using just a single two-wheel bogie with a volute spring and the large on-ground trailing wheel at the back, along with separately sprung half bogie. Once more, the driver was to be on the left in another two-man tank, but this vehicle was not armed at all. With armor up to 1 inch, 25 millimeters thick, and weighing in at 9.75 US tons, or 8.85 metric, the light tank T6 was roughly the same size and gives a good idea of a potential power plant for Barnes's tank, namely a pair of 8-cylinder Buick gasoline engines. However, even so, it was more than 2 tons heavier and still had armor no thicker than 1 inch, 25 millimeters, and importantly, no armament. Comparing Barnes's idea to light tanks T3 and T6 gives an indication as to how unrealistic the idea really was. It is hard to see any merit in Barnes's design. The armor certainly would have provided excellent protection from the relatively small caliber weapons then in service on a lot of tanks, but those were the previous generation. Against a 37mm anti-tank gun, such as the type used in numbers in Spain to good effect, even 38mm of armor is not going to be of huge help, although it certainly would have made the tank impervious to infantry, which did not have access to a cannon. What then was Barnes really proposing? A small, lightly armed and heavily armored tank may have had some utility against infantry, but with the only armament being in the front, it would, as the Italians found to their cost, prove perhaps a little untenable. If, however, Barnes was really considering a small tank destroyer, then why bother with the armor at all? Concealment and maneuverability would have been of far more use, and he could reasonably have mounted the gun in an open-top setting for a wider arc of fire and more space to carry ammunition. Both ideas were also stymied by the selection of just 2 crew. there was simply too much for 2 men to do in combat, so a slightly larger chassis would also have allowed a 3rd or 4th man to operate the gun, but would have also seriously increased the weight and decreased the mobility. Finally, Barnes's concept of mobility was flawed. There was no way he was going to get even more armor and an automatic 37mm anti-tank gun into a vehicle no bigger than the 9-ton light tank T6, along with a larger engine, and still have the same performance. Likewise, he could not have allowed the weight to go over 7.5 US tons, 6.8 metric, as this was the limit set in 1933 by the Secretary of War for light tanks, suggesting a reason behind the heavy part of the name, and that is before the price tag for the vehicle was considered. Quite which of these or other faults undid his idea is clear, but it is perhaps fortunate that the concept died quickly. The US still had a long way to go in its journey for an effective and mobile tank destroyer, and it would not be until the onset of World War II that they would get one.